Welcome to this week's edition of Creative Current. My name is Clare Graham. We're at Moriort Gallery in Highland Park, California. I am seated in the middle of my gallery and studio space. The building is about 7,000 square feet. It's divided into sort of three areas. One is a changing exhibition gallery, about 1,200 square feet. A sort of cabinet of curiosities, that's the larger portion, about 4,000 square feet. And then the remaining areas where I actively work and create things. My take is to be a hunter-gatherer, find materials, things at flea markets, swap meets, garage sales, on the sort of post-consumer end of things, and then repurpose them into art, much like the paradigm that Simon Rodia used in Watts Towers. I'm seated on a large sort of lounge chair. It's made out of about 600,000 pop tops. And, you know, a lot of people ask how long it took to make this thing. It's hard to answer that because it's a whole process. It takes, obviously, many weeks, many months, years, perhaps, to collect some of the materials I use. Then you clean them, you sort them, you pull out all of the cigarette butts and bottle caps and bar change that came with them. And then you're ready to begin. You make an armature out of rebar, which is a sort of construction site leftover, cover it with hardware cloth screening, and then it's like tufting a rug. It's mindless, repetitive work, but it is very sort of centering. And while you're busy working, your mind is doing 100 other things at the same time. So I tend to fall into those sort of mind-numbing repetitive tasks and do the same thing over and over again on the order of millions of times. I've used about 13.5 million pop tops in what I do. I've used 5 million or so buttons. So obviously the numerical count on all this stuff is of great interest to me. Something else I do is I'm very, as a hunter-gatherer, very opportunistic. And I tend to respond to things that I see. For instance, at a flea market, walking down an aisle, you will suddenly be hit by an epiphany of, you're just gobsmacked by something that you don't understand it, you don't know what it is, but there's something that's keyed that says, take me home, take me home. And so what I do is I drag it back here. I try to figure out if I have other things like it. I tend to work very repetitively, so a certain kind of form I respond to. Some of the things you can see in the background here, there's this, it was an old wash tub, and it's a really fascinating object because it was something that guys on weekends with their guns go out to the desert, and they use anything that's sitting off in the distance as target practice. So a lot of big metal things like cars and wash tubs and refrigerators and Dr. Pepper machines end up out there being used as target practice. So what happens over many years, maybe decades, is these things get hit with so many ballistics that they turn into these sort of lacy gossamer at their last vestiges of holding together as an object. And so it's this beauty, this aesthetic that's born out of violence. And I think there's a very nice kind of thing to awaken people to in that out of this very extreme act of guns piercing metal, something really beautiful and ephemeral can be created. I've got many examples of that around here. I've got a Dr. Pepper machine from about 1943 that was shot up and is just, if you touch it, it vibrates. It's so just lacy from the carcass that was left from it. Another object that was sort of born out of that response of seeing something that struck a note is the chair that's in front of me here. And coming into the studio one morning out on a curb was this sort of overstuffed, dilapidated, tired, sad object. And for some reason it called out to me that the basic form of it was very intriguing. Sort of streamlined, it looked like it was walking out into the street to save itself. And so I threw it in the back of the van. A bumper sticker that says, I brake for cool objects. So I stopped, put it in the back of the van, got it over here, and tore all the upholstery off of it. And what was left was this very unique wooden form that allowed me to laminate it with thousands of tin can lids. Tin can lids are another one of those things that takes quite a while to accumulate. I have many friends who know sort of my process, and so they encourage me by weekly saving anything that might go out in the trash. Pop tops, bottle caps, tin can lids, etc. And so this became sort of a tin can lid surface covering this fragile wooden form that now will extend that piece of furniture's life a little bit. We're only these sort of temporary custodians for a lot of objects, and I'm trying to do my best to render them into, breathe a little more life into their life. That's part of the process. Obviously, one of the things I'm most interested in is the patina that objects accumulate over their lifetime. You know, as I grow older, you lose youth, but you gain so much more. I've never understood why people have plastic surgery, because it's an endless fascination, the changes that happen to oneself as one ages. One of the things that I collected for about 20 years are rosaries. And rosaries are used in the Catholic Church as a prayer, a way to enter into a prayerful attitude. This has about 3,200 rosaries. And it took me almost 20 years to collect all of these, one or two at a time. You know, you'd go to a flea market on the weekend and you'd see them laying on a table and you'd pick them up, had no idea what I was going to do with it. Brought them home, started putting them in file boxes. And part of the process that I work with is every once in a while, collections of things get to an overwhelming point where there are so many boxes filled with them, they sort of say, it's time to do something with me. So rosaries reached that point where I had over 3,000 of them. And so I sort of thought about the residual prayer power that each one of these used individually multiple times, saying a rosary. So it's this large accumulation of the raw rosary beads. The interesting thing is it's got a light on the inside of it. So when I turn it off at night, a lot of them are phosphorescent and they absorb the energy. And when I turn it off, there's this glowing green column that's sort of very, the aura about it is really terrific. Other things that are piled here are buttons. Almost all of the projects I work on are, there's no design. It's sort of a process. And I start at the beginning, and like Topsy grew, these things have a way of just developing their own form and content as it enlarges and uses up the supply. Again, another piece out of Pop Tops, a large hanging disc. And one of the things about my studio space is there's a lot of theatrics, a lot of smoke and mirrors that is going on here. Very large building, 28-foot ceiling. So it allows me, like the goldfish theory, to expand to fill the size of my container. So a lot of these are not domestically scaled. There's very few people who ever find the need to move one of these things into their domestic living situation. At some points in this studio space, I get very literal about what a cabinet of curiosities is. And one such item is this large tin can lid laminated cabinet. Little porthole so you can sort of get a glimpse of what's inside. But then when you open it, it doesn't reveal its mysteries lightly. I tend to be very interested in things that I don't understand and cause that little creative epiphany. So on the top here are a series of things that a Philippine sign painter had used for many years. And I love the accumulation, again, that patina of how many brush strokes it took to get that much accumulation of paint on the rim of this can is simply amazing. And, you know, he had different color pots, and then this was his styrofoam cooler that all of these pots sat in with his brushes. And look at the incredible sort of Jackson Pollock effect that an object like that naturally accumulates over its lifetime. On the lower shelf are a series of porcelain molds that are used in basically a production line to dip into latex or rubber for medical appliances. We have things like a Mickey Mouse balloon shape, there are water bottles, there are colostomy bags, there are condoms, there are various things that the medical profession uses, but what just that process leaves these really incredible objects. High fire porcelain would be used on a production line, and now they sit here to intrigue people into some of the beauties of the industrial process here in America. Another object that sits close here is this accumulation of jigsaw puzzles. In my endless quest for materials to use, part of the problem is sheer economics. And when you're dealing with millions of objects, you're of course trying to find things that are as low as possible in the sort of spectrum of art supplies. I can go to thrift stores and for a quarter buy a box of jigsaw puzzles, get anywhere from 500 to 1,500 pieces. So what we have here are individual packets of jigsaw puzzle pieces. And I'm kind of playing with the fact that in our DNA, in our cells, is this code that is intact if you could only learn to read it. And the Human Genome Project is doing that now. It's sort of figuring out everything about it. So this is a very sort of gross example. If somebody were to take this object, slice the pods open, take the puzzle pieces, put them back together, there's something there. There's a picture of Niagara Falls or the Grand Canyon. So it's one of those sort of parallels to DNA and cells and microscopic becoming the larger world. Also here are one of the first things I ever collected, and they're called knockdowns, cats, or punks, and they're used in carnivals to throw baseballs at. When I was in college, I was studying cycladic art, and there's a sort of frontal aspect with big staring eyes on these very simple sort of iconic forms. And these, to me, when I first encountered them, struck that same chord, that they are sort of abandoned, they're abused their whole lives, and so I started just collecting them because it reminded me of something that mainstream art said was aesthetically, you know, paramount. So I've got about 560 of them now, and they sort of live here happily together in an orphanage for punks. As part of my education, I received an MFA from California State University, Long Beach, and did the traditional sort of art training route. And obviously, anatomy and the inner structure of form is one of the focuses. So I tend to respond to animal bones, human bones, when I can find them, and collect them as a means of fondling and studying and sort of deriving the inner skeletal structure necessary to support an outer form. So a lot of what I do is because of the bone that exists on the inside of a more fleshy object. So this is a collection of things that have just sort of fallen into my lap from mostly flea markets, a few garage sales over many years. And I both use them to study and then to make other objects out of them. There's a tower of vertebrae. There are coyote, there's some cow, there are a few horses, large land animals, all North American. But I like that sort of system of repetitive form and what it suggests sort of as a tower of form. Another one where sort of the spider-like way of knitting something together became the focus. There's also an interesting memento mori of my early life. The first thing I did with buttons is my mother, growing up in Canada, one of 5 children, we saved virtually everything. So every piece of used clothing, once it was worn out and no longer wearable, she would save collars, she'd save cuffs, and she'd of course save all the buttons. So while we never did anything with all of those pieces you save, one day you might need them. So when we moved from Canada, there were 8 Quaker oak tubs that were about 6 inches in diameter and about 15 inches tall, filled with our family's old buttons, all multicolored, multi-sized. And so that's what became the basis of this piece is, buttons that I had a very early relationship with growing up. My brothers, my sisters, my mother, my father, they're all here in some sort of form that was part of their lives. Another very literal take on Cabinet of Curiosities here at Moore York is this series of large teak cabinets that I actually sourced from a place in Jakarta, Indonesia. And they were the sort of shop fittings for a batik shop. And the reason I like them is batik cloth, when it's folded and piled, is fairly heavy. So this is 1-inch true dimension teak. So they're very strong, and I can pile all of my odd miscellany in them. The lower glass cases are filled with a series of things that prompt me to into sort of creative exploration for what I could do. One of my favorite forms is this, and there's a real kind of interesting break. This is Vanishing Technology. You'll find that younger people coming in are fascinated by the fact that there's this sort of prayer wheel rolling disc and a container of some sort. People of my generation remember these on every desk, in every office, where it's a stamp moistener. And you'd put water in the well, and by rolling this, you could put moisture onto gummed labels or stamps and seal them. Younger people have no idea. Everything is pre-gummed now. It's all, peel and stick. And so it's an interesting, you can sort of gauge age by their familiarity with this stamp moistener form. Many objects in here that are collected because it's a mnemonic device. I tend to keep a very literal sketchbook of objects of 3-dimensional form that I can go to any one of these and rekindle that moment of epiphany when I first saw it and revisit that creative idea of what I wanted to do with that thing. So a lot of the stuff after I get it is pursuing enough of it, trying to figure out how to adequately honor it in a way to give it that life that I talked about. Another thing that is sort of a very personal diary of time I spent is this large tower that is sort of 15 stages of dove and pigeon feathers. When I was doing my MFA project at Long Beach State, I would take a lunch every day from 12 to 1. I'd go out on the quad area and walk under all the ficus trees and collect all of the feathers I found. So this is a 15-week period. Each of these climbing steps is a week. I was finishing my MFA project. So, there are many points on this tower that I sort of remember the process that I was going through, and that has led me into using the process more than the finished product on all of these things that I do. One of the things I'm interested in is how a similar process will manifest itself in multiple places around the world. And one of the things that that has happened with is a wire technique that is sort of supplementary to weaving. And it's a very simple hand-manipulated technique of creating a looped string of wire and then inserting the loops through the one that came before it. And you end up with a knitted structure. Ruth Asawa, Japanese-American woman, relatively famous artist, studied at Black Mountain, went to Mexico, was exposed to it by a very specific village in Mexico that used the weaving. Spontaneously, in Turkey, there's evidence of the same technique, producing the same kind of wire objects. Sumbawa in Indonesia also does it to a degree of refinement that is rather astonishing. It looks like it would have to be machine produced, but it's very controlled and regular, and it was the kind of activity that would make you blind if you kept doing it. And they are hats, very Dr. Seussian. and uncomfortable to wear actually. But hats. Ruth Asawa used them to do sculptural forms, big hanging amoebas that can be seen in the lobby of the De Young Museum in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. Some of the things around me here are other things I've done out of jigsaw puzzle pieces. I'm kind of fascinated by how you can turn the basic jigsaw puzzle form into as many different iterations of texture. And so here I stack them, I array them in horizontal lines, and it breaks up the light and gives you this variety of textures. When I was young, my parents, to keep me sort of occupied and out of trouble, would give me paint by numbers to work with. And those are the sort of outline areas that are all numbered that you have to fill in each of the areas with a specific color of paint. I tended to go outside the lines a great deal. But what I do now is I scramble for them. Flea markets, thrift stores are the best sources. But I collect them just over many, many years. So I end up with a large stock that I can use as a palette. I collect basically 24 pinkies, 24 blue boys, cut them up into standard grid, and then rearrange them so it becomes a dolly vision pixelation kind of fractal expansion, so you can create these large images out of the simple 2x2 squares. And these folding screens are an example of that, and some of them get very literal in what I'm doing. Basically, in Blue Boy, 2 separate artists, 2 separate canvases, but through the mystery of paint by numbers, they can merge and become one composition together at last. Another thing here is fortune cookies. I think everybody who has ever gone to a Chinese restaurant, you know, at the end of the meal, you open your fortune cookie and you find this slip of paper, and you know, you put it in your pocket or you drag it home and you throw it into the ashtray and you save it for a while. Well, I tend to glom onto them wherever I can find them, and I found this old mixer, sort of pre-electricity. It was for beating eggs in a large sort of copper pot for candy making. And just a fascinating form, very good gears, very substantial. And it had this rotating beater part on it. So what I played with was taking all the fortunes, putting them on this wire structure. So now when I use it, it's spreading out wishes and good fortune to everyone in the immediate vicinity. On a hot day, it's also a pretty good cooling exercise. A couple of examples of other things to do with buttons. Since they have multiple holes, you can string them in various ways to get different kinds of textures. So these are all strung so that they're very parallel and regular. Just gives a different kind of feeling for using the similar material. Additionally, very large coat buttons, but creating sort of a numerical exercise with an increase happening in each space or wad of buttons, so that as the stairway goes up, it expands. Another example of the paint by number things that when you look at this in the long view, it sort of unifies itself into a vision of a forest. But it's actually probably about 24 different paint by numbers, all whacked up. Obviously, you pick out similar vertical trunk and foliage pieces to create a larger image out of something that was typically 12 by 15, 12 by 18 in that range. So you can expand it to fill the size of what you're doing. Another thing that I'm interested in because of the sort of process that other people go through in their lives in collecting things is this tower of string. One of my favorite moments is coming into the studio one morning, little garage sale on a street just behind us here, and a man had died, a Chinese man who was in his 80s. He had his entire life collected every piece of string he came in contact with, bundled it, wrapped it, and put a little paper note on it that said what it was. When I went by the garage sale, out on the curb were sort of supermarket paper bags They were throwing them out. So this is sort of a tribute to my unknown neighbor, all of his pieces of string and his little labels, and something that he valued and I value now inordinately too, because it's the sort of record of a life passed in anonymity, but it has this really great essence of a lot of the things that I'm involved in, the patina that we accumulate as we grow older. Part of my process is that I involve myself basically 7 days a week in 10 to 12-hour days doing my art, which is collecting, cleaning, organizing, assembling, creating, and then rearranging this vast sort of cabinet of curiosities. I'm not accessible via cell phone. I'm a Luddite, so I don't cotton to new technology. I do have a computer. I do email. I have a website at claregraham.com, my name.com. And the best way to reach me is by contacting me through the website or through the LAart.org group. The local community has an art walk, which is the second Saturday of every month. And there's say anywhere from 20 to 30 galleries that are all open on that one night. If you haven't explored Northeast Los Angeles, the Highland Park area, a lot is happening here. The neighbor is nucleating. We're still very artist friendly. Lots of good studio spaces available. Come and see us.